Hi, welcome back. Preciosity here with part 3 of the critique of Professor Saad's speech before the University of Ottawa discussing political correctness and the limitation on freedom of speech and expression. All right, well, once more into the breach. Let's go.
Here's another incredible example. Laura Kipnis. Does anybody know that case? Only a fewer, okay. Laura Kipnis is a professor of, I think, film studies and media at Northwestern University. And again, notice that these are all very elite universities. It's not as though this type of atmosphere is something that is reserved for some outlier quack schools, right? These are, the hotbeds of intellectual thought, certainly in the United States, and of course, in many cases in Canada. So she wrote an article where she was rebutting this idea that, women are being raped all over campus. And by the way, she's an ardent feminist, right? She's a woman. She's an ardent feminist, so she holds all of the correct identity politic chips on her side. She wrote an article where she was trying to put in context that, maybe we need to sort of get a bit of a grip, that it's simply not true that there's this massive, gang rapes going on everywhere, right? Well, students filed a Title IX charge. Title IX is a federal statute or act that basically says that you cannot deny, access to education for people based on their race and ethnicity and gender and so on. And the fact that she had written an article as an academic to rebut their position was threatening to them. So her expressing an alternate position was threatening. They would feel unsafe, and hence they wouldn't be able, and future students wouldn't be able to safely attend this university because of the position that she had taken. So to argue against somebody else's position becomes a form of assault that should be punished. Not good.
All right, so there are not two ways to talk about this. This was just not true. It's just false. Everything that you say about it is wrong. What the article was about, why it was written, what the students were angry about, and why the Title IX was filed. That's all incorrect. All right, so let's talk about this article. This article was not about how many sexual assaults were taking place on campuses and that they aren't as frequent as people think they are, or as feminists want you to believe. In fact, she doesn't mention anywhere in the article how widespread assault is. That's not what this is about. Her article was about the right of students and professors to have sexual relationships with each other. So, allow me to read from this article, since apparently you didn't read it yourself. When I was in college, hooking up with professors was more or less part of the curriculum. Well, that must have made for an interesting syllabus. She also talks about drinking and partying and getting high and sleeping around with her professors. And if you're wondering if she slept with any of her own students, yes, she has. Though she says she doesn't much want to anymore, whatever that means. She does get all excited, though, when she talks about how an assistant professor was flirting with her, even though she was, quote-unquote, an aging biological female. So, yeah, so it was a great read. Wonderful. That I have done for you, Professor. Did this for you. You should have done your own research, but instead I had to do it. Now you may ask yourself, why did Northwestern change the rules? I'll just read from an article about the incident that appeared in Vox. Why Northwestern Investigated a Professor for Writing an Essay About Sexual Panic by Libby Nelson. Kipnis's first essay was provocative, but students didn't file a formal complaint because she defended professor-student relationships in general. Their objection was to a few paragraphs in the middle of the article where she described and drew conclusions from a tumultuous case at her own university. In 2014, an undergraduate sued Northwestern, saying Peter Ludlow, a philosophy professor, got her drunk while she was underage, forced her to come home with him, and then groped her while she slept. The professor claimed the student insisted on coming home with him and then made sexual advances. The student argued that the university didn't take appropriate action after she reported the assault, which led to PTSD and a suicide attempt. After the undergraduate filed her lawsuit, it became known that a graduate student in philosophy had also accused Ludlow of sexually assaulting her. The graduate student had, with help from another faculty member, previously filed a Title IX complaint against him, accusing him of non-consensual sex. Now, I'll summarize this part because otherwise I just have to read the whole article, plus the one in Huffington Post, both of which I will link. The complainants against Miss Kipnis state that the professor made some errors when she discussed these particular events in her essay, which she eventually cops to, but they say that when they contacted her about this originally, she ignored them, at which point they filed a Title IX. Back to quoting. Title IX also forbids retaliation against people who report sexual assault, including subjecting them to adverse action, treatment, or conditions. So the students were concerned about this being written as an act of retaliation, and they're concerned that, you know, if you have to be afraid that if you come forward with a complaint, that one of your professors from the school that you're complaining about is going to take it upon herself to write an article that spreads misinformation about you and your complaint, accuses you of being melodramatic, strongly implies that your sexual harassment was not bona fide, quote unquote. Of course that's going to make you not want to come forward. Of course that's going to be in your head. It's just crazy to me. You're wondering why I'm so annoyed. Not only, Professor, did you make this video the sad truth, I'm guessing that was ironic, but you doubled down on this. You had that guy who does the cartoon stuff, or the drawing stuff, I guess, and he sketched this out and he made a whole picture of it, and that's a separate whole video that's on your sad truth. It fit your narrative, so you never bothered to check, or even worse, you did check and you didn't care. This is plainly unacceptable, and I don't know how else to say it. Moving right along. Miss Kipnis eventually had to answer some tough questions, which ended up with no findings, and she wrote a follow-up essay about the whole Title IX process. Mr. Ludlow was found guilty of sexual harassment, but not assault. He sued the young women and the school, and this lawsuit was dismissed.
And now we've got the beautiful microaggressions. This actually happened at one of my two alma maters at McGill. So Brian Farnan, VP of the Student Society of McGill University, sent out an email with the words, "Honestly, midterms, get out of here," followed by a doctor clip of President Obama. Has anybody seen this clip? It's, let me, I don't know if it will. Yes, you have? Okay. I'm not sure if it will. The edited video, so let's see that.
I appreciate the tenor of the conversations. I think it will actually yield results before the end of the year, and I look forward to continuing this dialogue in the months ahead. Thank you very much, everybody.
Okay. I mean, this literally was an attempt to say, you know, right, get out of here, exams. I'm sick of exams. I'm tired of exams, right? Here's what ended up happening. The image in question was an extension. This is after he's bombarded by a witch hunt of social justice warriors. He's forced to issue an apology, which includes the following quotes. The image in question was an extension of the cultural, historical, and living legacy surrounding people of color, particularly young men being portrayed as violent in contemporary culture and media. By using this particular image of President Obama, I unwillingly perpetuated this living legacy and subsequently allowed a medium of the Student Association's communication to become the site of microaggression. For this, I am deeply sorry. Right? So this person who put together this clip as a means of sort of demonstrating his frustration at the workload that he had had to apologize for this microaggression. Let's look at the next one.
Okay, so he was not bombarded by a witch hunt of SJWs. So this guy, Brian, he sends the email out to 22,000 people, and one person complains about it on a McGill-sponsored student website. The school reads it and then goes and makes Brian apologize. The student who made the complaint ends up apologizing as well because he apparently just wanted to start a conversation and not a huge situation. McGill is now reviewing its procedures, which sounds like a good thing. In fairness, it's kind of tough to find out what actually happened here because everyone in the media leaped on it so fast and hard, and opinions were way ahead of information. Unfortunately, that happens a lot today, and that's why you have to approach some of these things with a little pinch of salt, if you will. So now we have my third alternate hypothesis, the you want free speech, well, money talks hypothesis. So this hypothesis is talking about the explosion of college costs in the United States going ahead of the rates of inflation overall. This influx of cash has not gone to professors, as the American Association of University Professors reports that 76% of faculty across all U.S. colleges are poorly paid and precariously positioned adjunct professors that can simply lose their jobs at the end of a semester by just not getting rehired. And conservative politicians like Scott Walker have been trying to weaken what tenure protections there are. So, of course, this affects the dynamic between students and teachers in administrations. At Yale, the yearly fee for students is almost $46,000. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm putting out that much money per annum and I have a complaint, you better listen. You wonder why that lady wants a homey environment, and I wonder why she doesn't want a mint on her pillow. And untenured professors are for sure going to be walking on eggshells, because when every student is a source of that much cash for their bosses, they're not going to want to upset the kids. So a lot of the reading I did for this response, including the sources you provided, talk about this consumerist model or the business professional type model. And in another, for instance, the Mizzou case, I don't think it's a coincidence that the administration ignored the student protests until the sports team got involved and threatened not to play. American universities make huge bank off their students when it comes to sports teams, and there is a lot of competition for the best athletes. Student debt is definitely one of the biggest issues for millennials, and really for anyone in our society who wants to remain cutting edge in years to come. Now, I looked up some stats, and while it's not as bad in Canada, their costs have been rising for years as well. So I would honestly consider that maybe, just maybe, shaming these young students and calling them names is far less likely to be successful than focusing on the deleterious effect of this big money dynamic.
This could be construed as part of the rubric of microaggressions, but I gave it a different title. It turns out, by the way, that being respectful and kind is a form of racism. So let's look at this one from Queen's University. So Anisa Rawhani decided to wear a hijab for, I think it was 18 days, to see how people, she's an Iranian woman, but I think she's either Zoroastrian or maybe Christian. I can't remember exactly what she is, but she wasn't a Muslim woman. And she wanted to wear a hijab to see how people would respond to her when she wore a hijab. And it turns out that, to her surprise, she found that people were very kind and polite to her. Now, of course, what I would come with the conclusion, if I have a functioning brain, is that, well, maybe there aren't massive number of rabid KKK racists walking around everywhere. But she couldn't have that conclusion. It turns out that this This overt tolerance and kindness is a manifestation of overcompensating for people's latent bigotry and intolerance. Being kind and tolerant is racist. In other words, by people being polite, kind, gracious with her when she was wearing a hijab, the only possibility is that they were compensating for the latent hatred that they had in their heart. Therefore, all roads lead to racism. If I am racist, I'm racist. If I am kind, gentle, tolerant, and non-racist, I'm racist. How could I not be a racist? I can't in the world of modern academia.
So what we have here is a classic straw man. Let's read what Rawhani actually says to clarify. At first I thought I was just imagining things. There's no way this is actually happening, Rawhani told thewig.com. I went with my hijab and people were very nice. People were polite. Parents would shake my hand. So the experience was all across the board in Kingston. In some cases, she said, she would go out with friends who weren't wearing any identifying religious symbols, and she was treated much nicer than they were. There was this excess of niceness that I would experience that I couldn't account for, she said, like really going the extra mile, like smiling broadly and being so polite, which I've never experienced before. It was a stark contrast that was going on that threw me for a loop. Rawhani discussed her findings with a psychology professor at her university. She calls the interesting phenomenon an overcompensation. It can be that someone actually does harbor racist tendencies but doesn't want to look racist to others, so they overcompensate in that way, she says. She also says that it could stem from people who might think they have a bias but are trying to suppress it by being overly accommodating to people of other races or religions. In general, just from my interactions, I think people honestly believe in equality and have those values, but they just don't know how to interact with minorities, she says. Next.
Trigger warnings, yes. Trigger warnings on course syllabi. Oberlin College is really one of the places that's on hyper steroids of social justice warriors. They keep trying to outdo themselves. So they started with this whole, or at least they were one of the first to start with this idea that we should have a motion that requires professors to be aware of racism, classism, sexism, heterosexism, cis-sexism, ableism, and other issues of privilege and oppression. It also calls on professors to remove triggering material, anything that may cause a damaging emotional response when it doesn't directly contribute to learning goals, blah, blah, blah. So I thought, all right, let me look to see what types of topics might warrant a trigger warning. So here is a small list for you, and I will read them for effect. Discussion of sex, consensual sex. So I teach evolutionary psychology. Humans reproduce. They have this thing called sex. It's hard for me to teach the evolution of mating preferences and evolution of sexuality when the topic of sex is a triggering topic. You see the problem I'm in? You see the bind that I'm in? Pregnancy is triggering. Childbirth is triggering. Addiction, alcohol, needles, drug use, bullying, suicide. Death is triggering. Serious injury, sizeism, ableism, homophobia, blood, vomit, insects, snakes, spiders, slimy things, swearing, rape, abuse, child abuse, descriptions of medical procedures. That's going to be tough at a medical school. When I'm getting my residency in neurosurgery, it might be difficult to argue that those procedures are triggering. Corpses, skulls, skeletons, discussions of isms, dismissal of lived oppression, kidnapping, scarification, discussion of violence or war, Nazi paraphernalia, and anything. This we got to come up with sort of a brand topic if we haven't already covered everything else. Anything that might inspire intrusive thoughts for people who might be on the OCD spectrum, we need to have a trigger warning. So literally, anything that almost any professor could ever talk about may potentially require a trigger warning. Check out my trigger warning. Using your brain to navigate the real world should not entail a trigger warning. This course will assume that you possess the cognitive and emotional acuity of an adult. Life is your trigger warning.
First, to clarify that much of what you say here is a straw man, as this trigger warnings guideline specifically clarifies that these warnings should come when the topics are not an expected or obvious part of the material. For instance, let's say you take a course in Victorian literature, and in a discussion of Alice in Wonderland, the teacher decides to bring up modern-day rumors of Lewis Carroll being a pedophile and discusses different ideas of childhood sexuality and child pornography. And there's one student in the class who's reliving the most horrific moments of their life without having had the opportunity to even take a deep breath first. So, since you've brought the matter up, I will beg your forbearance for a moment to discuss some relevant personal experiences. So after the birth of my second child, I had a severe crisis-level experience of postpartum depression that came on suddenly, and it's hard to explain to people. It feels like you're losing all control of your mind. This is terrifying and painful. I sought and received necessary help from a psychiatrist, and one of the specific things she prescribed, in addition to medication, was to limit certain types of stimulus that were too upsetting for me to handle in my state at that time. So as far as I could, I did this, but like most people, I had a life to live and a job to do. And you'd be surprised how much these really disturbing, violent things come up when you don't expect, and that's very hard. Also, during my experience as, in a community college I went to, I went with an Iraq War veteran. Nice guy. He was clearly trying very hard to do the best he could, but he was a little off. All of this was prior to the days of trigger warnings, but I just think you should consider that mental illnesses of various types are more widespread than you might think. It doesn't mean anybody's weak or childish. And in fact, most people are working really hard to maintain their normal lives. I know it's always easy to talk about people like, you know, in this way, like why can't they just toughen up? But I hope that someday we'll have a better understanding of this, and we'll realize that telling people to deal with their traumas is like asking a diabetic to stop being a pussy and metabolize your glucose like a man. You know? That day is not today, obviously. And I fear that until we get smarter about that, trigger warnings will be band-aids at best and excuses to make fun of people who frankly have enough problems at worst. But, you know, on the other hand, whoever came up with these spoiler warnings for horrificness, thanks. It was a nice thought. Next.
Sorry, I don't know why it came out 111. It should be 123. In case anybody is triggered by the number 1. One of the dangers of trigger warnings is that, not trigger warnings, of thought police and political correctness, is that people engage in self-censorship, right? You may not see this, right, because it's latent, right? So before you open your laptop and start writing that article that you want to publish on Huffington Post, you have to think, oh, should I do it, or will the social justice warriors come after me? My wife will often come nervously behind me when I'm working on my laptop, and she looks nervous. She says, oh, well, what are you writing? And I said, well, I'm writing something. What is it? And she'll say, remember, we have 2 children. Now, the fact that a mother could look to her husband in the 21st century in Canada, he's a professor, and she's arguing, please be careful with the words you use because we have young children. She's not saying this because she's some, paranoid lady who's unaware of the realities of life. That's, right? That's the proverbial robin singing in the coal mine. Where is it? Not robin, canary singing in the coal mine, right? I mean, that's saying something quite profound about the type of environment that we live in, where you have somebody who is afraid for the safety of their children.
Ironically, my husband and I had several very similar discussions prior to my posting on YouTube, specifically since a lot of openly feminist women have had a really tough time. We decided to go ahead, but it was not a sure thing. So, it's tough all over. And that sucks. That's kind of not okay. People shouldn't be afraid for their children to speak their minds. Anyway.
This is precisely how totalitarian anti-liberal ideologies flourish. Number one, if they can, in certain places in the world, they simply literally behead you. Say the wrong thing and you're dead. Now, in the West, you can't do that yet. But what you can do, you could behead them in other ways. You could behead them by stifling them through various non-violent means. You could harm somebody's reputation. So Richard Dawkins, many of you know him, right? You can't behead him in the West, but you certainly can try to tar him. You could try to make him out to be a neo-Nazi, hateful, racist bigot. He's none of those things. He's about as liberal as you can get. You could go for Sam Harris and say that he is a Dr. Mengele, Hitler-type guy. He's none of those things, right? And of course, you could create a climate of fear where you just censor yourself. And then that's it. We don't have to worry about you saying anything that is against our ideology.
You haven't proven your thesis at all, and now we've wandered into thought police. Orwell was describing secret government agents who use surveillance, torture, and terror to enforce national dictatorship. But hey, just like you can misrepresent individuals like Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins and refer to them as Dr. Mengeles or Nazis, totalitarians, how much easier is it to stereotype whole groups? I mean, it's super easy because now it's not even any individual thing a specific person said, but you're responsible for anything anybody ever said or did who agrees with you on this other opinion you might have. Would you like to be held personally accountable for anything any professor ever did, or even any Evo Psych professor? I doubt it. Then why toss such vitriol around about students? Do we have to talk about Dawkins and Harris? I suppose we do. There are different cases in my mind, so I'll mention them separately. Regarding Dawkins, I feel for him because of his recent illness and just want to say that I hope he gets better. It makes a full recovery and does it as soon as he can. And I'm pulling for him in that way. Because he is a great mind and he is a decent person. But let's also, on the other hand, just be real for a second. Nobody ever had to tar his reputation for him. He kind of did it for himself the day he got a Twitter account. There are some topics, such as rape and child molestation, for instance, where if you want to hold forth with controversial opinions, a tweet is really not the way to go about it. And retweeting some vile cartoon comparing a young feminist to an Islamist, ending in a joyous discussion of rape, is no way for a public intellectual of merit to engage in discourse. If you want to sit at the grown-up table, you gotta act like a grown-up. And if you don't, that's fine. But you'll be marginalized because behaviors have consequences. Obviously, I'm talking about the disinvitation he received from any CCS over his misadventures with social media, such as the above. There's been plenty of talk about this, and I won't go too far into it. But one thing I haven't seen mentioned is that Dawkins has done essentially the same thing himself. When he changed about his mind about a debate with William Lane Craig, I think it was, and stated he would not share a stage with the man after he had said some things that Dawkins found highly offensive, and rightly so. And we can go back and forth all day about who's right or wrong, but I think the main point I'm trying to get over is that everybody has lines they won't cross, and that's got to be okay. For instance, let's say you decide that Charles Manson is an underappreciated musical genius, and you want to put a concert together celebrating his work, and that's fine, right? But if I own the stage, I have the right to go tell you to go find your own damn venue, because this one's mine and I owe you nothing. Now, as for Mr. Harris, all I can say is that people certainly have a right to disagree with him. And considering that no man in this age has received more intellectual chivalry from people such as yourself than he, the Society for the Defense of Sam Harris's honor is alive and well. So I don't really feel the need to toss my 2 cents in. I will say more generally that it is not nice to call people awful names unless you've considered their opinions carefully, or to misrepresent people either. Professor, Ms. Rawhani and the 2 students who were victims of sexual harassment from their professor do not have nearly as many prominent public apologists as Mr. Harris does, so perhaps a little caution might have been in order. And wrapping up our evaluation, again, we end by evaluating how each of the arguments that has been presented, each of the pieces of evidence that have been presented, how well they support or don't support the primary thesis, or describe how political correctness is limiting the free expression of ideas. So first we have the article about Laura Kipnis. Yeah, I'm still a little upset with you on this one, Professor. I'm going to be honest. I think that your dishonest and or lazy treatment of this particular article and what we were talking about here was really, you should have done better than this. This is, I would actually expect better if you were Fox News, and it's unworthy of your title, and it's unworthy of the students that you have been talking to. So I'm sorry, but no, we are not going to be using this in support of your thesis. Secondly, we have the issue of microaggressions. The young man, Brian, this would support your thesis with the exception that this particular instance has caused McGill to look at its different protocols and how they respond to these kinds of issues, and is actually end up in a net gain for freedom of speech, as they do seem to be more sensitive now than they were. Unfortunately, that poor student Brian, I do think it's unfortunate that he was made to apologize or that he had suffered that embarrassment. However, he seems to be doing just fine, and he was apologized to again. Third, we have Anisa Rawhani, who put on the hijab. This does not support your thesis. I'm not sure how it would support your thesis even if you hadn't completely strawmanned and misrepresented her, but certainly the fact that you did doesn't help. However, it is hard to see how her decision to wear a hijab and report her findings, positive, negative, or otherwise, could have caused a limitation on the free expression of ideas. No arguments have been made for this. It's just sort of assumed that because she was politically correct and an SJW, that this naturally caused thought policing in and of itself. This is not a statement that you can simply make without providing any evidence of someone actually unable or in some way limited to their expression of ideas. Next, we have trigger warnings. Trigger warnings present them do not support your thesis. You have demonstrated that you don't like them. However, you have not demonstrated that they are limiting what teachers are talking about. Those people who are in favor of trigger warnings seem to state that they think that they, in fact, increase teachers being able to talk about uncomfortable things by providing that sort of little cushion there, that little get out of jail free card, if you will. Similar to when I was a kid and before any really juicy segments would come on the talk shows or Oprah or any of those kinds of shows, they would come out and say, oh, this is for mature audiences only. And then they could get away with talking about whatever crazy thing they wanted to, basically. Now, this may not be true, and this may be limiting somebody's decision to teach certain things or not teach certain things, or I really don't know. But you haven't demonstrated that that is happening, and therefore this cannot be used in support of your argument, because that would be necessary, not just to say that trigger warnings exist, but that they in some way limit the free exchange of ideas. Next, we have thought police, which is a rather odd argument. Again, we've talked about disinvitations, which we have agreed that disinvitations to speakers is a curtailment of the free expression of ideas, though not necessarily always an inappropriate one. Still, the issue with this thought police is the fact that so few teachers and professors and people are speaking out against this issue is used by you as evidence for it, that they aren't speaking out because they're just too afraid to do so. So if they did speak out, that would be evidence. And if they don't speak out, that's evidence. Either way, that's evidence for your thesis. And it just can't work that way. So we need something a little better than just your say-so that people are scared, and that's why they're not complaining. Unfortunately, that may mean that some of your colleagues will have to get a backbone if they are genuinely concerned about this issue. And if they're not genuinely concerned about this issue, then I guess they don't need to do anything. So now from here, we will go on, I should think, to the next episode. We will discuss Professor Saad's conclusion, where he makes some prescriptions based on our review of the evidence presented. He is making prescriptions before we have a diagnosis, but we should review them anyway, as they are certainly informative. Also, there is a Q&A section, which I will only be showing parts of just in the interests of time. And that will finally get to our very last part. Yay! So I will see you guys again in part 4. Bye!